In this video, I'm going to show you one simple technique that's going to change your color grading forever. So I have two clips here that were shot on Blackmagic. My timeline color space is Davinci Wide Gamut, and my output color space is Rec. 709A. I'm pushing it out to online and I'm working on a Mac. Now the first thing is we need to change the color space from Blackmagic to Davinci because we work in Davinci, and then from Davinci out to Rec. 709. I usually have a few serials here, let's say 3 as my primary adjustments normally. I'm going to show you this new thing that I'm doing, which is going to seem very simple, but it's not necessarily easy. We have our Blackmagic clip here. We're moving it from Blackmagic to Davinci, then Davinci back to Rec. 709, and we're doing the grading here in the middle. If you are new to the channel or you're not sure what I'm talking about with these two nodes, I have tons of other videos covering this. Here we have our primary adjustments. Usually we do exposure here, and we do something like balance here, and we do something like saturation, the contrast. So we go exposure. Best exposure that I like to use is HDR, and we expose up and down. Right? Then the next one would be contrast. We go back to the primary wheels. Maybe you want to increase the contrast here. We start playing around with the wheels. This would be a normal kind of workflow. So I don't do this at all anymore. And I'll show you why. Let's reset this. Delete these guys. And it's the same thing, actually. You'll see what I mean. But this node does pretty much like 90% of the work. I don't use the wheels for contrast at all anymore. I use one node that controls the exposure, the contrast, and the saturation. Now, obviously, if you have to balance it, you'll still need a balanced node afterwards. But with this guy, I'm going to show you how I manipulate the contrast. So how contrast works, just look at the parade on the scopes. You can see it takes the whole image and kind of like stretches it out, right? And then when you start manipulating your lows, your mediums, your gamma, and your high, it also changes the relationship between the three. But with the wheels, you are very stuck to the zones the wheels are mapped to. So you're just moving these 3 parts in different ways to create contrast. What I love to do is to use the custom curves for contrast. Now, if you look at any type of cinematic shot, they have certain characteristics. And the characteristics are the highlights are usually low, the blacks are high, yet the image feels dark, and the contrast actually happens in the middle of the shot. And with this curve, we can emulate that. So in this node, I just want you to look at the image and you'll see what I mean by this. This is the Rec. 709 image we get right out of the camera. I'm going to reset this guy. I'm going to make sure editable splines are on because it's going to give me this. And with this, when I start manipulating my curve, it's going to create a really nice rolling effect compared to if I turn off the editable splines and I start manually, taking points here. You can kind of see the transition between the points aren't really as smooth as you want it. So I tend to stick to editable splines. Now let's look at this image. I know a characteristic of the cinematic look, like I said before, is low highlights. So I'm going to pull this highlights down. Looking at my image, I'm looking at the parade. I'm also looking at my false color here on the other shot. And I'm going to pull down the highlights so that my highlights get capped around here, but then play with this editable splines. The more I push this thing up, the more of a kind of arch, like shape you get in your image. And this means all the information is here. It's kind of like in the middle. When I start pulling this up, I am introducing light. I'm raising up the middle. So if we go down here, you're raising up the middle, and at the bottom, we kind of do the opposite, right? And then raising this up. You're going to see what's happening to the image, right? I'm looking at the parade as well. I'm looking at my false color. Telltale sign that the footage is kind of cheap. It's usually a super high contrast. The blacks are super black and the highlights are super high. It makes it look cheap and digital. Now the film look is actually the opposite. So you get the contrast in the middle, which you can see here. Like the higher we make this thing, you can see the contrast line here. The more intense the contrast of the middle of your image is going to look. Yet your highlights and your shadows still have a nice roll off. This might look pretty simple, but even the smallest little adjustment you make here has a big impact on your shot. So becoming really good at manipulating this curve is going to dramatically increase the look of your color grade compared to any other tool. I've just created a private group and I'd love for you guys to join. In this group, I'm going to post these types of videos, exclusive videos. I'm going to interact in that group a lot more than I do on YouTube. And I've also included a beginner masterclass, which is going to give you good fundamentals to start your color grading journey. And the best of all of it is free. So if you are interested in joining the group, I'll put a link at it at the bottom of this video. What I do here is play around with it. I use my eye, and this will come with practice. Okay, I kind of like where it's sitting at right now with contrast. I want to add some saturation. So I'll add saturation here. Saturation will go up. And now I'm kind of playing around. You see, when I pull this back, it introduces more light in this bottom part. And I'm just going with my eye to kind of see what I like. It's a bit of a ratio between this guy, your saturation, and if you go to HDR, your exposure. And with these three tools, I pretty much get 90% or even 95 to where I want the image to be. Let's even go darker. So this really super interesting, the type of looks you can get just by moving that a little bit. You get a completely different feel of the grade. So we started from here out of the camera, right? And now we're here. It's already moodier, but it doesn't feel washed out because you have that contrast in the middle. But it's a really nice like roll-offs at the bottom and the top. Now we're at 90% of it. Maybe the saturation needs to go down a bit. Now you can start doing balance. And if you want to do a secondary, you'll start individually manipulating the saturation. Maybe you want to change the greens. Maybe that saturation at the back is a bit too strong. But just with this contrast curve, with the saturation and the HDR, like exposure, I mean, we're there. Let's try this on the next clip. So I'm just going to copy this entire grade I did here. And I'm going to go here. This is also shot on Blackmagic. I'm going to paste. Already looks great. I'm just going to start actually from the beginning to show you again. Okay, so this is out of camera. You can see highlights are kind of blown out. It just doesn't look great. Okay, so now what we do is you go down to money node that does all the work. You pull down the highlights. I always use the face, by the way, the skin as the reference of how far to pull down the highlights and the contrast curve in the middle. It's a really good reference point because if you get the face right, but even let's say something else is blown out or too dark, you can individually go and change those things. But if you get the skin right, that's the main thing. I'm going to pull down the highlights. I'm going to push up the blacks. I usually use this as a reference point. I kind of like when my blacks are around here. I think that's a marker I put on. Where did I put that on? Yeah, show reference level. It's at 64. So I use 64 as a reference level to keep my blacks there. And then cinematic shots always have kind of like that depth, that density feeling. You can get that by bringing up the blacks so it's not too dark and increasing the amount of darkness at the bottom of your image. So we'll do the opposite here again. Bring that up. So I'm just looking at the face here. Let's bring down the highlights even more. The top part. Now we're going to play around with it. And this is all up to you. This finessing, there's no real way I can tell you this is how you do it. Like this is actually where the color grading comes in. It's personal preferences. And I would definitely just advise you to look at the image, play around with it. If I move it up or down, what does it do to the image? If I move it right to left, what does it do to the image? If I move it like diagonally, like you have so much control. So I'm just looking at that image right now and I'm making really minor changes. I'm looking at my false color. The face is a little bit dark, but it's not too bad. I might pull this even more this way, where you'll see it starts raising in a different part of the scene. And I think for now, I'm going to put it there. I'm going to increase the exposure a bit. I'm going to play around with the saturation. By the way, saturation, it's up to you if you want to use the HDR or the SDR. There's no right or wrong. I usually just use the SDR one. Now I'm just finessing. You see how nice and filmic that feels because the roll-offs, it's the top and the bottom roll-offs. That's all it is really. And it's this curve in the middle. So we started from here out of the camera and we ended up here. Look how much nicer that looks. That like does 95% of it. So that's the simple little trick. It's a technique that I would definitely implore you guys to practice. Just sit there, get the footage in there and play with these custom curves. This is the technique that will change your color grade forever. If you become a master at this curve, your color grading is going to skyrocket. So I definitely urge you guys to play around with this. Put in some clips, play around with this custom curve. You can use Sony footage. It doesn't have to be the best Arri footage and really create that cinematic type of feel. I use this in every single project I work on.